Hello and welcome to Lesson 7 of Social Studies. Today we'll be looking at states' rights versus federal power. Some of the key words: nullify, secede, authority. So yesterday we spoke about what is federalism. And federalism is the system where you have one national government and then you have individual states having their own governments. Well, sometimes, as we saw over the weekend, there are conflicts between federal and state. And this brings us to today's topic, states' rights. States' rights is the belief that individual states should have more power to do what they see fit. And states' rights in American history has usually come up when we're talking about this region of the United States, the South. The South has always had a strong tendency towards states' rights, and it really goes back to slavery. The southern states had more slavery than the northern states, and they wanted to make sure the federal government did not abolish or get rid of slavery. There's also a strong streak of states' rights besides slavery, just the idea that the federal government shouldn't tell states what to do. So there were two times that southern states tried to nullify or cancel out federal laws. 1798, Virginia and Kentucky, these two states. In 1798, they tried to nullify a federal law against criticizing the government. You can learn about that on your own if you're interested. It's called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alien means an illegal immigrant. Sedition means talking bad about your government. So there was an attempt to nullify in 1798. And then in 1832, there was an attempt to nullify another law. This time it was South Carolina, which decided to nullify a tax, a tariff. Tariff is a tax on goods that comes into our country. And they did not like that. And they almost seceded. But they didn't. Secede is when a state tries to break away from a country. Sometimes they do actually break away from a country. Sometimes they try and fail. The verb is secede. The noun to describe it is called secession. Secession. So when states decide to leave a country, it is secession. And it has happened, unfortunately, in the United States. It happened in 1860. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. And he basically won only states in the North. And he also won California and Oregon because they were states. But most of these in here were not states yet. And Lincoln had said, if I am elected, I will stop slavery from spreading throughout the rest of the country. He didn't say he was going to abolish slavery, but he said, I'm going to stop it from spreading. Well, that was enough to make these southern states very angry and upset. None of them voted for Abraham Lincoln. So South Carolina, again, took the lead. And in 1860, South Carolina seceded from the United States. How did they do that? Well, they had a conference, a convention in their own state, and they all agreed, we're leaving. Well, I wouldn't say all agreed, but they took a state vote. The state government voted to secede. And then 10 other states all agreed with South Carolina in the next couple of months. So by 1861, you had 11 states that had seceded. And they joined together to create the Confederate States of America. Well, you might be wondering, why would they leave one country because they didn't like not having states' rights? Now they're going to join another country? Yes, but this new country that they created, the Confederate States of America, would have a much weaker federal government. And the main point was they would get to continue having African Americans as slaves. Well, Abraham Lincoln did not like that, of course, and the Civil War broke out. And it lasted for 4 horrible years. It was the North versus the South. The North was called the Union, the South was called the Confederacy. And we will do a full lesson on the Civil War later on during this school year. But for now, we're just mentioning it to show you what can happen when states' rights gets out of control. The end result of the Civil War, long story short, is that the North did win, and the South was forced to end slavery, and they put it into the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. But that didn't mean everything was perfect for people in the South, especially African Americans. The white people in the South could no longer own slaves, but they still found new ways to make life very hard for black people, and we learned about it in school. We learned about segregation, Jim Crow laws. We didn't talk as much about it, but there was something called sharecropping, where African Americans basically lived on white-owned farms and worked for very little money, and it was almost like being a slave. So it was not very good. Now you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, didn't the North win the war? Didn't they make the South behave and follow the new laws, the new amendments of the Constitution? Not exactly. The North, after 12 years of basically keeping an eye on the South, by 1877 they had enough, and they left. The northern states basically left and moved back. They took the troops out, and they were no longer keeping an eye on the South. And this book, by the way, tells that story. It has to do with the election of 1876, which was decided by one vote. And when the election was over and Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president, he agreed to take the troops out of the South, and that was the end of keeping an eye on the South for the next 80 years. And the South could say, oh, we have our states' rights again. We can do whatever we want. We can do segregation. We can do racism. And unfortunately, they did. Until finally, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch of the federal government, got involved. And they made some important decisions. The most important was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Supreme Court has 9 members, and they decide cases that have important issues, constitutional issues. And this case was about African American children wanting to go to schools with white people, white children, and they weren't allowed to because of the racist laws, the state laws throughout the South, and even in the Midwest, because Brown was actually a student in Kansas, Linda Brown. The Supreme Court said 9-0 that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution protects equal rights for all, and that's for the whole country. So individual states cannot act the way they want anymore. Well, southern states basically ignored that, and it led to the Little Rock crisis of 1957. Little Rock is the capital of Arkansas, this state right here in the South. And the governor of Arkansas said, we have states' rights. We don't have to let black children into our white schools. It got so bad that the president, the leader of the federal government, and that's a coin bearing his face, the president was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he wasn't exactly a huge fan of civil rights, but he knew that the federal law had to be upheld. So he sent in troops to Arkansas to make sure that Arkansas followed the state law. So the federal government, long story short, spoiler alert, the federal government almost always wins when it comes to disputes with the South. Another important issue was the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The House voted for it, the Senate voted for it, the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed it, and it said that civil rights must be protected through all the states. Well, a motel owner in Atlanta, Georgia said, wait a minute, what about my rights? I own a motel and I don't want African Americans coming in. His motel was called the Heart of Atlanta Motel. He sued. He said, you can't make a law telling me who I have to serve and let them stay in my motel. It's my business. It's private property. The Supreme Court listened, but they said 9-0 that you do not have the right to refuse people based on their race because it is interstate commerce. We talked about this yesterday. Interstate commerce. When people do business or deals from one state to another, it's interstate. So the Supreme Court said, if you go to Atlanta, Georgia, and you're African American, you might have been driving from South Carolina and you need a place to sleep for the night, and they don't let you stay there, that's violating equal protection. That's violating interstate commerce equality. So that motel owner lost the case. Okay? And very quickly, states' rights has also played into presidential elections. In 1948, Strom Thurmond, who was from South Carolina, ran. He was a Democrat. He left the Democrats to become States' Rights Party, otherwise known as Dixiecrats, and he actually won 4 states, all because he wanted to keep segregation and states' rights going. And then 20 years later, George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, he basically ran on the same ideas. And in 1968, he won 5 states: Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. So it just shows that states' rights is a powerful idea, but the long story short, again, is that the federal government usually wins the day. And all 50 states do have to follow certain things, especially if it's in the Constitution. Who decides what the Constitution means? Well, the Supreme Court does. And so that's why those racist laws in the South were erased from the books. And now there is no legal segregation anywhere in the United States anymore. It is against the law. Thanks for watching. Leave your comments and questions below. I hope everyone's staying safe. And we'll see you next time on the channel. Bye-bye.